Chapter 2. Herschel and I stood in silence on the roof of the Diamond Beach high-rise. Far in the distance, dark clouds surged forward in the blue sky, churning with a heavy roil as some unseen force propelled them from behind. The darkness moved with unnatural momentum toward the edge of Galveston. The happy blues and whites overhead withered and died as black devoured the buoyant color. The great floating city of LUX and its epic tyrants had arrived. We took position in the makeshift command center we'd constructed on the roof of the high-rise. Herschel made his way to a series of control switches linked to remote rocket launchers he'd set up the day before on the outskirts of Galveston. He grabbed a pair of binoculars and stared at the approaching clouds. Wind billowed around us, swirling in all directions. The advancing line of shadow crawled over buildings and swallowed up streets. The distant Galveston Aquarium, a tall glass pyramid that glistened under the sun, dimmed as the expansive shadow washed over it. The once vibrant glass became murky, like dishwater. Block after block was engulfed by the inky blackness. The wireless comm in my ear crackled, and Abigail's voice called through its speaker. "Teams, check in." I peered northeast across town toward the Schlitterbahn water park where Abigail was posted all alone behind a sniper rifle. "Blue team ready," I said through the comm. "Green team ready," Briggan answered a second later. I glanced southwest at the Gary Green vacation rentals where he and Wade were posted. Galveston was a narrow island strip right off the coast of Texas. The five of us had spread out, each taking a different section of the island, since we weren't sure exactly where the epics would touch down. "You never picked a color for yourself," I said. "That's because one person can't be a team," Abigail said. "Jax is right," Briggan said through the comm. "You should still have a color." Abigail was silent for a beat.
"Any of you remember boxed crayons? You know, from grade school?"
"What the hell year you think we were born?" Herschel said indignantly. "I'm not talking to you, old man," Abigail said. "I meant the kids." I rolled my eyes. Abigail had a habit of calling Wade, Briggan, and me the kids, as if we were a bunch of innocent children. Maybe Wade was still innocent, but not Briggan, and definitely not me. And as far as Herschel went, Abigail was easily older than him by half a decade, but she never acted like it. "Yeah, I remember crayons," I said, picturing vivid rows of color in yellow boxes. Crayons were one of the last childhood luxuries I could recall before the world fell completely into pieces. "Well," Abigail continued, "when I was a kid—" "And what year was that again?" Herschel interrupted. "Shut up, dinosaur," she retorted. "When I was a kid, my favorite crayon was called razzmatazz." "So that's your color?" I asked. "That's my color." "I like it," Briggan said. "Now stay alert," Abigail said, pulling us back on task. "Keep your eyes high and don't do anything stupid." The wind whipped around us, sometimes blowing from the east, sometimes from the west. Finally, a tip of jagged rock pierced through the bottom of the clouds, widening as it descended over the heart of Galveston. Distant screams echoed from the streets below us. My attention stayed locked on the shrouded sky. Additional spires of rock punctured the clouds, as if a great inverted mountain was descending upon the world from the heavens. It wasn't long before there was no more sky, only craggy, uneven rock. More screams joined the cacophony. The streets swarmed with panic as the remaining citizens of Galveston sought shelter from the spires of rock slowly lowering from the sky. "Get ready with the honeybees," Abigail said through the comm. Herschel set down the binoculars and sat at a terminal fitted with headgear and 2 joysticks which controlled the pockets of drones we'd hidden throughout the city. His thumb carefully avoided the red button atop the left joystick. "Ready," he responded. "Ready," Briggan's voice crackled in my ear. "Both teams, launch your drones," Abigail said. "Jax, keep an eye on the fathom readings." Herschel and Briggan launched their swarms of drones as I studied the screen in front of me for activity. "The tunnels are clear," I said. "No ravens yet." The drones shot into view from distant buildings and sped straight toward LUX.
Direct the drones halfway up the tunnels and start drilling,
Abigail continued. Copy, Herschel and Briggan responded. My monitor showed the drones flying toward a series of vertical tunnels that punctured all the way from the bottom of LUX to its surface. When the drones were inside, they attached themselves to the walls and burrowed into the rock. Before long, streaks of movement entered my Fathom radar display. I've got activity, I said into the comm. Ravens, a few hundred at least. I stood from my terminal and grabbed a pair of binoculars, peering through them at the tunnel entrances. On cue, a swarm of little black dots poured from the tunnels in the airborne rock mass and dropped from the sky like a huge flock of birds. Wearing black armor and carrying weapons that jutted out at sharp, dangerous angles, the soldiers fell through the air like twisted barbs. LUX's ravens. I steadied the binoculars, searching for Lifeforce's shape.
Does anyone have eyes on him yet?
Abigail called over the comm. I've got wing flare descending over 103rd up past the waterworks, Briggan said into his comm, but Lifeforce isn't with her. My heart flinched at the mention of wing flare. 103rd was straight ahead of Herschel and me. I leveled the binoculars and searched the sky. Wing flare. The very mention of her name made my skin crawl. She was one of 4 epics up on LUX, and second in command to High Epic Lifeforce. I adjusted the lenses for a magnified view and locked onto her. I knew I was supposed to be searching the sky for Lifeforce, but I couldn't pull my focus away from her. She wore no armor or weapons, only a white dress that stayed perfectly still despite her momentum and the heavy winds pushing against everything around her. Her face looked like polished marble, cold and expressionless. Not a single strand of her waist-long, perfectly straight white hair moved as she descended. My jaw clenched as my grip tightened on the binoculars, and my heart thumped in my chest. Though Lifeforce ruled the city of LUX, granting immortality to his people, wing flare made it the mobile terror it had become. She kept the entire city of LUX in the air, as well as transported Raven marauders back and forth on raids, and yet she had the focus to keep every hair on her head in place as she fell. I imagined I was looking through a rifle scope instead of binoculars. I could almost feel myself pulling the trigger and spattering her white dress in red. Briggan's right, Herschel said over the public comm. The man of the hour ain't with her this time.
Keep watching, Abigail responded. Maybe he's simply late to the party.
But I wasn't searching the sky for Lifeforce anymore. All I could see was the white demon, the floating witch who had taken so much away from me. Jax, Herschel said to my left. His meaty hand rested on my upraised arms, coaxing the binoculars away from my eyes. You holding it together? I lowered the binoculars and glared at him. I'm fine, I snapped. Yeah, he said. I can see that. I sighed and forced my attention to the last wave of the descending Raven army. At this distance, I could barely make out the red stripes on their black uniforms that ran diagonally from shoulder to hip, insignias denoting their rank. They touched down and scattered like a nest of cockroaches suddenly exposed to sunlight. The armored vultures poured through the streets, entering the abandoned buildings nearby as they searched for survivors to enslave and treasures to collect. When we'd first arrived, we tried to spread word through the city that LUX was on its way. We told the people there would be death and devastation. Some listened and left the city. Some didn't.
No one else is coming down, Abigail said. Lifeforce is a no-show. All teams stand down. The mission's off. We'll follow them to the next destination and hope Lifeforce shows his face.
Rage burned inside me as I watched wing flare float serenely above her army. I wasn't about to let her get away. But everything's set up right now, I protested into the comm.
And we'll set it all up again next time, Abigail said. Pack up.
We can't lose this opportunity, I pressed. I know Lifeforce was the target, but I can still make it work with wing flare.
That doesn't make sense, Abigail said. You said you needed Lifeforce, not her.
I can make it work, I insisted. Trust me.
Jax, I know where your head is at. This isn't the time for revenge.
This isn't about revenge, I argued. I can make the plan work, but I need to get some of her DNA. Even better if it's splattered all over the ground.
Let's regroup and plan it out, Abigail said. This isn't the sort of thing we should decide now.
We have a chance, and we have to take it, I said.
Jax, we're not rushing into anything. Fall back and regroup.
Herschel set down his joysticks and grabbed a canvas duffel bag, then began filling it with equipment. I spun my brother's Boston University silver class ring around my finger, a finger that not so long ago wasn't big enough to wear it. Time to balance the books, I whispered to myself. I reached over Herschel and pushed the red button at the top of his left joystick. What the hell are you? A series of hissing noises sounded in the distance. White smoke trails shot upward, then arced over the city and sped toward the clusters of ravens on the ground. Wingflare noticed the rocket trails at the last second and shot higher into the air. Plumes of fire erupted below her, illuminating the whole city block in orange flames. Crackling explosions dotted the ground, and buildings crumpled in on themselves, burying groups of ravens in rubble.
Blue team, what's going on?
Abigail shouted into the comm. Herschel glared at me. You crazy kid? The mission's off! I'm not letting her get away this time, I said, running to the center of the roof where my motorcycle stood facing the edge. Jax, don't, Herschel said. But I wasn't listening. Wingflare was mine. I stared out at the buried raven army. The missing Lifeforce would undoubtedly be trying to heal the crushed ravens, despite their corpses being too broken and buried to move. Eventually, they would heal, but temporarily eliminating the army of ravens like this bought us time, and that was always our most precious resource. Wingflare reached toward the rubble. The ruins shifted as her powers slowly lifted the broken debris. The ground rumbled as the burning pieces rose from the ground and hovered in the air, uncovering the ravens trapped underneath. I hopped on the motorcycle and started its engine. Jax is, Herschel grunted into the comm. He's moving forward. No, Abigail said. Jax, do not. Abigail, I said, I need you to trust me. This is our best chance. Without waiting for a reply, I hit the accelerator, and the bike shot along the roof. I spared a glance toward the blurred tires. I had equipped the tread with a motivator, a device that harnessed the DNA of dead epics to mimic some diluted form of their powers. This motivator housed the DNA from an epic named Crystallix, an epic who could form crystalline structures and surfaces in the air that wouldn't fall. I'd attempted to create a pair of boots that exploited Crystallix's power, allowing each step in the air to create a crystalline surface that would carry my weight. It had worked. Sort of. Motivators tended to be quite a bit more unstable than the epics themselves. In this case, the crystalline surface only lasted for a fraction of a second, never giving me enough time to fully take a step. The structure of the crystals dissolved too quickly. I either needed to step much, much faster, or I looked again at the spinning tread of the motorcycle tires. Here goes, I whispered, rocketing off the edge of the building. The bike didn't fall. Crackling crystals sounded below me as the tires left a trail of blue that dissolved only inches behind me. I felt like a rock skipping across a pond, barely fast enough to use the momentary surface tension as a road. My tests on the motivator tech prior to this mission concluded that the bike would have to move at a speed of 50 miles per hour minimum to stay in the air ahead of the dissolving crystals. I'm going to need the second wave of rockets if we're going to keep her distracted, I said over the comm. We all waited in silence for Abigail to respond. Do it, she said, her voice stiff and tight with irritation. Copy, Herschel said. Another volley of remote rockets shot toward Wingflare's position, but she was ready this time. Before they could reach their targets, the missiles stopped mid-air, their engines spewing fire but unable to move. Wingflare then turned them around, spraying them back in the direction from which they'd come. Building tops exploded, raining metal and concrete over the streets. Where are we with the honeybees? I asked. They should be deep enough, Herschel said in my ear. The bunker blasters are in place. We need to blast it, I said over the comm to Abigail. She didn't respond. It's now or never. She released a heavy sigh into the comm. Light it up.
I held my breath, waiting for Herschel to detonate the bunker blasters. 22 drones burrowed deep in the heart of LUX. The explosions that followed sounded like the earth itself had shattered around us. Huge chunks of rock blew from LUX's core. A shockwave rippled through the air, making my bones quiver. A massive crack ruptured along the entire length of the floating city, forming a deep chasm through its underside that shot along the base in both directions. The crack widened. Boulders rained down over Galveston, leveling everything they touched. I weaved back and forth in the air, dodging the meteor shower around me. From this height, I had a view of the whole city as buildings were wiped out and massive craters pocked the streets. A deep fracturing sound echoed above me. I lifted my chin to look. The crack in LUX from the bunker blaster explosions stretched longer and longer in both directions until it spanned farther than I could see. The powerful roars it released were deafening. I could feel it in my chest like a pressurized tightening. Then, unbelievably, the entire city overhead broke. We'd cracked the sparking city in half. I stared at the colossal thing, unable to do anything at all as the two halves peeled away from each other and fell. It looked as if the sky itself was bending around me. The logical part of my brain reiterated that this was all part of the plan, but fear charged through me, welling inside my chest. What if we were wrong about Wingflare's strength? What if this was all too much and she couldn't hold it all together? If LUX fell, so would Galveston. And so would we. The great floating city would decimate the world below with its impact. I would have single-handedly doomed millions. I wondered how many people would share the same awful grave if we were even a little mistaken. The noise was piercing. Clouds of dust rose from pockets of brutalized earth. The seat and handlebars rattled from the shock waves through the air. I focused on Wingflare up ahead. "Don't let it fall," I whispered. Her arms stretched high above her head toward the torrent of boulders that continued to bury themselves with cataclysmic force into the ground below me. "Jax," Herschel called through the comm in my ear. "She's not holding it. You need to get out of there." I ignored him. There was no turning back. If LUX fell, we'd be dead no matter what. But this was the opening I'd been waiting for, and I had to take it. A dark shape drew my attention upward. A chunk of rock, larger than a sports stadium, fell directly in front of me. "Jax!" Herschel shouted again. "Turn around!" "I can't," I said into the comm. "The motivator, it—" He knew as well as I did. Slowing down or turning too severely meant no more Crystal Air Road, and no more me. The enormous boulder ahead trailed loose rocks and dust behind, as if it were a comet. It would soon drop right where my motorcycle would be. I revved the bike's engine, speeding, undaunted, toward the large shadow of the rock's approaching impact. My bike passed into the darkness, and I could almost feel the dense weight hanging above me. The closer it got, the more its immensity warped the sound around me, muting the raging Armageddon. I cringed, lifting my chin to glance up at the monstrosity that was about to end my life. The shadow around me deepened. "Come on," I whispered. "Hold it." I waited for the mountain overhead to crush me. But it didn't. I spared another glance upward. The colossal rock was frozen overhead. "Yes! Yes!" I shouted, racing forward. With another deep groan, the rock rose, and the dark shadow around me paled. I scanned the skyline. The hailstorm of rubble, as far as I could see, was all doing the same. Slower and slower the pieces fell, until they were no longer falling at all. 100,000 boulders simply froze in the sky. I finally passed from under the rock that had nearly fell on me and looked at Wingflare up ahead. Her arms were outstretched as she engaged in a motionless battle, the force of her powers holding the sea of rocks at bay. Finally, she shifted, but the thousands of boulders remained still. Her gaze went upward, as if she was only now ready to face the monumental task of piecing the massive city back together. Strands of white hair whipped about her face, and dimples rippled through the white dress. It seemed the demands of her task took too much concentration for her to maintain her typically undisturbed appearance. Lifting her arms in defiance, she pushed with her powers. A rare moment of emotion winced through her face as lips pulled away from teeth against the strain. The creaking roar of the yawning chasm overhead softened, and amazingly, the two halves of the city stopped moving. The raw feat of power left me awestruck, stealing the breath from my lungs as I watched. Wingflare screamed, and then the two halves of LUX groaned and tilted upright, the giant chasm stitching together piece by piece. This was it. My one opening. "Herschel," I said into the comm, "I need you to redirect a honeybee to my location."
"Sending one your way, kid."
A minute later, the oversized drone hummed a few feet over my head, speeding through the air alongside me. In one motion, I stood from the motorcycle seat and leaped into the open air. My fingers curled around the drone's landing rails. Its engine whined under the added weight. Hopefully, the drone would be able to make it before its engine overheated. My abandoned motorcycle idled slower and slower until it fell from the sky, no longer able to outrun the dissolving crystal trail. The honeybee lifted me higher, right toward Wingflare. As we'd hoped, her focus was completely consumed by the immeasurable task of holding the city together. Miles away, Herschel guided the honeybee from his rooftop perch. It silently carried me behind Wingflare, careful to keep me out of her line of sight. The Epic's concentration strained as she worked to reverse the damage we'd caused and return the shattered pieces of a vast stone puzzle to their home.
"You ready?"
Herschel called through the comm. "Send me up," I said, taking a deep breath and drawing the sword on my back from its sheath. The drone's engine roared, and I shot straight upward. Consumed by her task, Wingflare was too distracted to see my approach until I had nearly reached her. She spun around, a look of shock on her usually imperturbable face. I drew back and swung at her head with my sword. She lurched backward, and the sword passed under her ear. A wave of invisible force slammed into me, ripping my hand from the drone's rail and throwing me backward 100 feet through the air. "Herschel!" I yelled.
"It's coming!"
he yelled back. A line of reserve honeybees raced up from the ground toward me. I grabbed the first rail I could reach and tried to steady myself in the air. "Go!" I said over the comm. "Get me out of here!" But the drone didn't move. "Herschel, get me out of here!"
"I can't," he said. "The honeybee's at full power, but it's not moving. She's got too much of a grip on you."
I turned my head. Wingflare. Slow and steady, she floated toward me until she was near enough to speak. Her hair still rippled in the wind, if only barely. "All this for me?" she said, glancing up at the once broken city. Nothing more than a thin, scraggly line bore evidence that LUX was once split in two. Everything we had worked so hard to break was now unbroken. "So close," Wingflare continued, floating nearer. "And yet all for nothing." There was a hollowness to her voice that made it sound almost artificial. She floated yet closer, and closer. Our faces were only inches apart. I remembered every bit of her face from the last time I'd seen it. Skin like hospital plastic, hair bleached to bone. Every part of her filled me with unquenchable rage. I glared at her, my hands itching to take another swing at her throat, but her powers held my limbs rigid, and I couldn't move. If she recognized me, her eyes didn't show it. And why would she? I was never anything more than a speck to brush away, while she was one who'd altered my very existence. But that was how epics lived, unaware of the countless lives they wrecked. "Before you die," she whispered, "you deserve a kiss for your bravery." She leaned in, and her pale lips gently pressed against my cheek. They felt like ice and poison. Her arms lifted as if ready to throw me to my death when a bright line of red streaked across her cheek. A second later, I heard the delayed crack of the gunshot from Abigail's perch. Wingflare shrieked and pulled away, clutching at the graze on her cheek from the bullet. She scanned the sky for the location of the mystery attacker. With her attention diverted, her hold on the drone loosened, and it sped away as fast as its overpowered engines could take it. Wingflare gave me one last sideways glance as the gash in her cheek wove together from Lifeforce's healing powers. The look in her eyes echoed what she'd said to me. So close, then all for nothing. Before she could stop me, more 50 caliber bullets ripped through the air from Abigail's expert aim. Wingflare pulled up a section of shattered asphalt and yanked the pieces toward herself. The large chunks of debris swirled around her, forming a spherical shield. Bullets ricocheted off the surface, sparking harmlessly against the asphalt. With Wingflare's vision obscured, the honeybee sped toward the ground, pulling me behind a shattered pharmacy and into the camouflage of chaos. All around me, hundreds of ravens rose from the dead, their limbs and bodies fully regenerating. The honeybee sped through them, weaving in and out of side streets until it reached the edge of Galveston. From there, it carried me across the West Bay to safety. I collapsed into the sand at our rendezvous point on a beach with oversized houses and long docks. My energy spent, I took a moment to steady my breath and nerves. I touched the side of my head. The calm in my ear felt like a scorpion. I kept waiting to hear Abigail tell me I was a reckless, worthless child, that I wasn't fit to be a reckoner, that I was no longer a part of the team. But the silence was almost worse, and the longer she remained silent, the more I wanted her to get it over with, to scream and yell at me and deal out whatever punishment I deserved for being so stupid. Herschel was the first to join me, gripping the rails of a honeybee of his own and landing with a heavy fall into the sand. "You okay?" he said, eyeing my prostrate body. I sighed. "Abigail's going to kill me, isn't she?" He shrugged. "Probably." I sat up and watched as LUX continued its pillaging and destruction across the bay. "You think any of the residents will escape?" Herschel shrugged. "Couple lucky ones, maybe." None of us knew what LUX did with all the people they rounded up in their raids. Slaves, most likely. In previous recon missions, I'd seen the Ravens gather them into cages where they were lifted into LUX by Wingflare. "I heard through the comm that she was saying something to you," Herschel said. "What was it?" "She said we were so close, but it was all for nothing." Herschel nodded. "Well, was she right?" I opened my fingers, revealing the handful of white hair I'd managed to cut from Wingflare's head. "Nope." "Is that going to work?" I nodded. "I can make it work." He clapped me on the back. "Then your stupidity was worth it after all." "I don't know. That'll probably depend on how mad Abigail is." "True." Finally, the comm in my ear crackled to life, and Abigail's voice called through the speaker. There was a tension to it that had nothing to do with anger. "Blue team, prep a med kit at the rendezvous point. Brigand was hit. It's pretty bad." "What happened?" Herschel asked. "Wade and Brigand left their post at the Green Vacation Rentals when I called for the retreat, and they were exposed to a shrapnel burst from Jax's little trigger finger stunt with the rockets." An instant stab of cold regret lanced through my chest. "Is he—" I called through the comm in an unsteady tone. "He's only got half a face left, so you tell me, Jax," she snapped. Her voice spoke my name like it was something rancid. Herschel rummaged through his pack, gathering bandages and needles. I slumped down, my footing suddenly unsteady. What had I done?